Hello everyone, and welcome to Archaeology. I wish today I was coming to you in a better mood. Today is going to be there's going to be a three-part video, and that this three-part video is titled "There is no Archaeology Illuminati: A deep look at the false claims of Graham Hancock and an examination of the inner workings of the field of archaeology." These videos I am making because while I don't want to, due to recent circumstances, I feel mm, that I have to. And by recent circumstances, I mean the release of a new pseudo archaeology show. So, without ado, let's get into it. And I will say these videos are going to be long. I apologize, but I'm going to go in depth. So, a few of you may be asking, who is Graham Hancock? Well, Graham Hancock is a is an investigative journalist, most well known for his authorship of several books. The two most well known of these being the 1997, I want to say, Fingerprint of the Gods, and then the more recent from 2010, Magicians of the Gods. Graham Hancock is an individual who believes, essentially, in his own words, that the field of modern archaeology is corrupt and doesn't allow for the flourishment of new ideas, and that archaeology is either um, purposely overlooking the existence of ancient civilizations such as Atlantis, or they are purposely covering it up. Furthermore, in his 1990s book Fingerprint of the Gods, Graham Hancock openly states that he believes that this Atlantis civilization, of which he believes is the source of all the world's civilizations, was a civilization of essentially white people and only white people. Now, in the past 30 or so years, he has not said that openly, because of course he would get in trouble. But as we'll cover in these next three videos, much of the rhetoric he uses is still in line with that idea. Which brings me to the subject of today's video. Recently, like very recently, only a week ago, Graham Hancock released a new documentary series on Netflix titled Ancient Apocalypse. And in this series, an 8 episode series, he goes to various parts of the world, uh, and various archaeological sites in those parts of the world, and tries to connect them in one form or the other uh, to his hypothesis that this ancient Atlantis civilization it helped create the rest of the world civilizations. And so that is what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be going through each episode in this three-part video series, and I'm going to um, take a look at his claims and then take a look at what the archaeological evidence actually says. All right, so now we're going to go first to episode one. So, episode one of Ancient Apocalypse starts off focusing on an archaeological site in Java, specifically an ancient temple known as Gunung Padang, which is what you see here. It is an ancient temple that was built using volcanic rock that is naturally formed in these sort of trapezoidal, sometimes hexagonal shapes. Uh, and the archaeological evidence shows that generally the temple was probably built somewhere around 500 700 BCE-ish, BC-ish, with additional cultural layers going as far back as at least 7,000 BCE. Very old, and sorry, is at least 5,000 BCE. Let me correct myself. So about 7,000 years, a pretty decent run. And in fact, much of the population of Java has folklore that connects Gunung Padang to the semi-mythical king Siliwangi of the Sunda kingdom that existed from the 1200s through the late 1600s. Now, as I said, the king is semi-mythical. There are historical figures that he may or may not be based on, but regardless of whether or not he was real or not, he is connected via folklore to Gunung Padang, which makes the attempted connection of Gunung Padang to let me enunciate Gunung Padang, which makes the attempted connection of Gunung Padang to Atlantis even more problematic, because that is an attempt to take away the cultural heritage of the well-known and well-established cultural heritage of Gunung Padang to the native Javan population, and take that away and place it on another culture that, again, has some connection, some racist connotations to it, which is not, as I said, that's very problematic. And to prove his theory, or attempt to prove his theory about, and back up his theory about the idea that Gunung Padang is connected to Atlantis, Graham Hancock brings in a geologist, and he is an actual geologist. He does work at a university, I believe, named Danny Hillman, the individual you see on your left. And together, they perform studies and they use coring technology to get to the absolute base of Gunung Padang, or at least the hill that Gunung Padang is located on. And they are able to find essentially some organic material, mostly wood, and they carbon date it, and the wood that they found at the bottom of the hill that Gunung Padang is located on dated to around 20,000 years ago. So taking that piece of wood that they found in the bottom of the hill, they took, in carbon dating it, they took that date and placed it well into the middle of the last glacial maximum, or what you would know, or most of our viewers would know, is the last ice age. I want to, before we go ahead, I want to make that distinction. I'll make it several times more. We are, despite common belief, we are actually still in an ice age. The ice age, the thing that most people think of in an ice age, is actually a glacial maximum, i.e., when the glacier is at its largest extent. However, despite this date that Danny Hillman and Graham Hancock attributed to Gunung Padang, most of the archaeology. So let me phrase it this way. Essentially, these claims were refuted and critiqued by 34 not just archaeologists but also geologists from Java. All of them agreeing that yes, the upper part is the largest megalithic structure in Southeast Asia. However, many, such as such as volcanologist Sutikno Bronto. I apologize for how much I butchered that. Sutikno Bronto makes it very clear that one, Danny Hillman is not a volcanologist, and he critiques one of Danny's other claims that the volcanic rocks that, as you see appear, some of them are lying on their sides. He makes a claim that there is some sort of mortar or cement-like substance in between them, and he makes that claim that essentially the mortar comes from 9,000 years, 20,000 years as well. However, Sutikno makes it very clear that the concretion, which is what it is, it's a concretion, it's not mortar, is from natural weathering, not man-made. And then other archaeologists who do not want to be named because of, as you can see over here, the Indonesian government's history with trying to connect these claims to very nationalistic and dangerous tendencies, states that they did find some human bones and tools made about 9,500 years ago, or about 7,000 BC. So, okay, so I was right for the first time. So going back to about 7,000 BC and BCE. But he also states that considering that they were bone tools and not necessarily stone tools, though they probably did use stone tools as well, that he highly doubts people in 20,000 BCE would be building a pyramid, because if the people in Java 9,500 years ago were still using bone tools more than stone tools, it would not make sense that they would be building a temple. And he goes on to say that in archaeology, we usually find the culture first, then we seek the artifact's age. And you can't see it here, but he also states that essentially all Hillman did was find a piece of natural material way at the bottom of this known volcanic hill and carbon date it, and then try to create a site out of that rather than finding the site and then doing the reverse, which is what most archaeologists, in fact, all good archaeologists would do. And here's the continuation. They find the culture first, and then they find the artifacts, and seek out historical references to any civilization which existed around that period, and only then will they be able to explain the artifact historically. In this case, Hillman found something, carbon dated it, then created a civilization around it. In fact, as I said, this is the hill that Gunung Padang sits on sits on, is a volcanic hill, i.e. that a long time ago, millions, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, it was part of a volcano. And so there are the top cultural layers, the surface soil, and then the first cultural layer in the green, and then the second cultural layer in the yellow. So what happened is Hillman dug all the way through the cultural layers into the volcanic material, into essentially a cave that may have formed out of what used to be the lava tunnel, which is not at all good archaeological practice, or geological practice for that matter. Another argument that Hillman likes to claim is that these volcanic rocks, the volcanic basalt is essentially what they're made out of, do not naturally form on their sides. However, you can see, so this is Gunung Padang right here. You see the volcanic basalt on the side, and so Hillman's making the argument that this just doesn't happen naturally. However, we actually do see that naturally. Here's one from the Chimiyu volcano in China, where you can see, yes, in fact, the basalt did form on its side, as well as forming on its side in Pinnacle Peak in Washington, Byakudo in Japan, and Battery Hill. So to make the argument that it doesn't happen naturally, when we have multiple lines of evidence, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of evidence where it did happen naturally, very obviously is just incorrect. The next site that Hancock goes to in episode 1 in attempts to attribute to his, as he calls it in the show, his Ice Age, Lost Ice Age civilization, is a site in Indonesia known as Nan Madol, which you see here. And he tries to again make the claim that some Ice Age civilization about 20,000 years ago came here and built Nam Madol, whether it be before or after the Ice Age, the glacial maximum. He refers to it as the Ice Age a lot when it's not the Ice Age. Anyways, after the glacial maximum ended and he built the city. What he doesn't mention, though, is that archaeologists actually know who built this city of Nan Madol, and it was the Saudulair dynasty that essentially ruled this area from around 1100 to 1628 CE or AD, depending on what type of measurement system you use. And they made their capital Nan Madol on this Indonesian island of Pohnpei, not to be mistaken at all with the volcano Pohnpei. With the city Pohnpei. This is a different thing, but on the Indonesian island of Pohnpei. And if anybody's from the area watching this is from the area, please feel free to correct me. And how do we know this? Archaeology. So, in fact, we have a recent paper from 2016 right here, and feel free to pause to read the abstract, and then here is their methods on how they got the accurate date. And as you can see here, and I apologize for the blurriness, the conclusion goes, we report the earliest secure dates on the construction of monumental architecture in the remote islands of the Pacific located at the site of Nan Madol is attributed to via high precision uranium series dating from coral and other parts of the tomb to the Saudulair dynasty, indicating political control over the entire island was established by 1180 to 1200 CE. And then you can go on and read the rest. So we do actually know very well who built this, and we even know where the stones came from, where it goes on to say the power of this new type of chieftain was materialized in the choice of the megalithic stone used in the construction of its leader's tomb, a notable portion of which was sourced using geochemistry to a distant volcanic plug. So, despite what Hancock would like to claim, archaeologists know for a fact that Nan Madol was built by the Saudulair dynasty roughly around 1180 to 1200 CE or AD. All right, now we go on to the next episode, episode 2. So the first archaeological site that Hancock goes to in the second episode is a pyramid in Mexico called Cholula. And Cholula, the archaeological records show that Cholula was built around the post-classical period was built Cholula was built, actually, to correct myself, was built before the post-classical period. It was built first in 500 BCE, and then it was built upon again in the post-classical period, etc., etc. And to his credit, Hancock does state that he acknowledges that the pyramid is at most as old as about 500 BCE. But despite that admission, Graham also makes the claim that that essentially, while the pyramid was built in 500 BC, it still has some connection via oral history to the lost Atlantis civilization, using how to put this, using the oral histories of Quetzalcoatl, and claiming that the oral histories and legends describe Quetzalcoatl as a pale-faced, heavily bearded person. Now, it's important to note that people in Latin America do grow beards, and so did Mesoamericans. In fact, there are many Nahuatl-speaking people and Mexica people, etc., who do grow beards. So there's that one problem. However, he's not. He is and he isn't wrong. So for one thing, we know, you can pause to read here, we know, based off of the types of pottery and the other artifacts found at Cholula, that Cholula does actually have some cultural connection to another civilization. That is the civilization of Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan being a very large city, just say, maybe 100 miles or so away from Cholula. So in the sense that Cholula is connected to some other civilization, Hancock is correct. However, the civilization is not Atlantean, it's another Mesoamerican civilization in Teotihuacan. In fact, it's not even surprising that Teotihuacan has some sort of connection. One, as you go back and read this a little bit, it's thought that perhaps Cholula was maybe I don't want to say a vassal state, but it had some sort, it was connected via hegemony, or it at least had, or at least was it either a satellite state of, like right here, a satellite state of Teotihuacan, or was it just simply connected via culture, and that's why they shared ceramic and architecture styles. It's hard to determine, but either way, we know they were connected. So, and it makes sense because Teotihuacan, while their main heartland was located roughly around here, around the state of Mexico area, we know that they extended their area of influence, their hegemonic influence, far north, up into the Loma de Santa Maria region, the Michoacan region of Mexico, and as far south as Guatemala and Belize. In fact, we know via archaeological and textual evidence from the Maya heartland that Calakmul and Tikal, two very powerful Mayan cities, had at one point in time alliances, and in the case of Tikal, eventually was defeated and forced to submit via, I don't want to say it's a vassal state, but a tributary state to Teotihuacan. So yes, Graham Hancock, Cholula is connected to a lost civilization, but it's a Mesoamerican. So it's a Mesoamerican civilization, Teotihuacan. So why you're trying to connect it to Atlantis is beyond me, other than the idea that the very common idea by conspiracy theories that that cultures such as in areas outside of Europe, with the exception of a couple of spots, could not build these monuments, which he actually states multiple times in this episode alone and in other episodes. So, yeah, which is incredibly problematic on its own. He then brings in a so-called expert, and this so-called expert is also a believer in Atlantis, and that is Marco Vitico, who wrote the book that you see here. And they proceed to look at a carving of Quetzalcoatl and claim that the curls of the feathered serpent, represent waves, and therefore they represent the sinking of an island, because there's a bas relief that vaguely looks like an island, and that sinking of the island is Atlantis. Again, Marco Vitico is not an archaeologist. He's not a historian. He's an author who writes pseudo-archaeology. Hancock then next goes to this aqueduct. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it so as I don't butcher it. But this aqueduct was an aqueduct that was built by the Aztec Empire. And it was a very incredibly designed aqueduct. And here again, to his credit, Hancock at least admits that it was in fact the Aztec who built this. However, again, he tries to connect the Aztec building of this aqueduct to his lost civilization. And he states that, in fact, this via rock carvings and petroglyphs that are earlier than the building of this aqueduct being present on the hill mountain. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but on this ridge that it was built on that predates the aqueduct's building, that the Aztecs chose to build this place because it was connected to the ancient lost Ice Age civilization. And again, he is sort of right, but also wrong. So, in much the same way that Cholula was connected to the lost civilization of Teotihuacan, which I should also say is not really lost, since we know exactly where the city is, and generally what the makeup of the population was. The Aztecs too were connected to a once powerful empire, and that is the Toltecs. And again, here is the Toltec heartland, and then the Toltec region of influence, again going into the Maya heartland. And in fact, we know that the Aztec would often inhabit cities that had once been power centers of the Toltecs, including this city right here, Tula. How do we know that? Again, archaeology. In fact, in this paper from 2017, pause the read, it talks about the Aztec taking over of the city. And it talks about the dates and everything, and talks about how the Aztecs specifically stayed in the city because of its connection to the culture they believed was actually their ancestors, their sacred ancestors, the Toltec. And here you go again. So, and again, pause to read. But so, as I said, like with Cholula, yes, Hancock, the Aztecs were connected to a lost, fallen civilization. The Toltecs, another Mesoamerican civilization, something that has nothing to do with Atlantis. Or with this, sorry, he doesn't call it Atlantis in the show, with the lost Ice Age civilization, Atlantis. So it's so the Aztec connection to the Toltec, while fascinating, and I highly recommend to reading this paper as well as the paper talking about the connection of Cholula with Teotihuacan. While both of those are incredibly fascinating and certainly important things to look at, the connection, they are essentially relevant to Hancock's hypothesis, which is a shame because, again, by taking away and ignoring the actual history, the actual beautiful history of these cultures, and moving them and trying to connect them to something that, one, didn't exist, and two, is based in problematic racist beliefs, it actually hurts. And that's just simply it. It hurts archaeology, and it hurts the cultures who were descended from these ancient cultures. Okay, now we move on to episode 3. Episode 3 focuses mainly, not mainly, focuses first on the various megalithic sites, specifically this one you see here called Gigantea. And Graham Hancock, upon visiting Gigantea and looking at how well built it was, he openly states that first he states falsely that archaeologists believe that the Neolithic people on Malta when it was built, Gigantea is thought to have been built around 3800 BCE. That when they built it, that archaeologists believe they suddenly woke up out of nowhere and built Gigantea, and then there was no practice or transitional thing and such, and then that's not how things work. Cultures don't get up and just start building massive monuments out of nowhere. And he's right. but the thing is, archaeologists aren't saying they did that. He also goes on to say that essentially, supposedly, there are no accurate carbon dates or any accurate dating based off of it used or found to accurately date the site. No carbon dating, no uranium 12 dating or anything like that. So yeah, and that right off the bat, that is incredibly wrong. In fact, we have this paper right here, authored by Rowan McGlaughlin, Eowyn Parkinson, Paula Reimer, and Carolyn Malone, talking about dating Maltese prehistory. And as you can see, one, there's our methodology. They list the types of ways that they dated it. And what's the first type of dating that they used to get the accurate date of the site? Radiocarbon dating. But it's also not the only type of dating they used. They used Bayesian phase modeling, density modeling, and density modeling. Those are their three ways they dated the site. And what were the results? Well, yet again, Hancock is wrong. There actually were transitional phases. The earliest phase being the early Neolithic Gardalam and Skorba phases, and then a hiatus in the 5th millennium, i.e. 4000 BCE. And then there was the Zebug phase, and then, look at that. Despite what Hancock says that there were no transitional phases, the Magar transitional Gigantea phase. And then you have the Gigantea phase. So not only is Gigantea not the oldest phase, we have multiple transitional phases. So we have the early Neolithic, and then there's a transition into the 5th millennium with a hiatus, and then that leads into the Zebug phase, and then that leads into the Magar phase, and that phase itself is a transitional phase into the Gigantea phase, and then on and on and on. So with, of course, the simplest temple phases being the debunk phase. So this is the problem with making broad statements without doing research. This paper took me 10 minutes to find. It's if you're going to make claims, at least look at the evidence. At least look at the evidence that's available. And when you make claims like that without looking at the evidence, it's only makes you look bad, not the archaeologists. So the next site he goes to in episode 3 is a site known as the cave site known as Gar Dalam. And yes, exactly. And so Gar Dalam is a site where it does have the earliest human phases being going back around to about 5,900 years ago. 5,900 years ago. Actually, let me double check that so that I am not making the wrong assumption. So, see the earliest. Okay, yes, about 5,900 years ago. Oh, yeah, no, 7,000 years ago. Sorry, 8,000 years ago. So, about 8,000 years ago, the early Gar Dalam is a site that has archaeological evidence showing human habitation from about 8,000 years ago. But starting in 1918, there was other proposed evidence showing that there was human settlement on the island of Malta before then. So essentially, the background is before this evidence was discovered, it was believed that humans only came to Malta first around 6,000 BCE ish, so around 5,900 or so. That's around 8,000 or so years ago. And then in 1918, in 1918, 2 teeth were discovered by Arthur Keith here, who then claimed that these 2 teeth matched the dental morphology of Neanderthal teeth. And it was backed up. That claim was backed up again in 1924, and then stayed relatively the same until about the 60s, and in which that began to be challenged. And so from about the 1960s onward, it was believed that these were not proof of the Neanderthals being here. And here are the 3 teeth. The 3 teeth that were found that were used as this evidence. Eventually, though, in around 2016, Anton Mifsud, ignore the 1997. I don't know why that's there. He only started his project in 2016, and in his own words, he only started his project in 2016. Anyways, Anton Mifsud and Simon Mifsud decided that perhaps they should be re-examined. You can pause to read this again. Pause to read this here. But eventually, as I said, Anton Mifsud decided it was time to re-examine these. And he had been contemplating it since 1991, but eventually did take it to several physical anthropologists who examined it and agreed with him that yes, that these were Neanderthal teeth. And so now he has come to the conclusion that yes, in fact, the Neanderthals did come to the island of Malta long before 6000 BCE. But something before I read these, I do want to bring something up. So it's a lot of people have pointed at, since this documentary has come out, have pointed to the situation with the Neanderthal teeth, and have also turned around and decided that essentially this was proof that of Graham Hancock's claims that the archaeologist community is corrupt. However, I think it's important to understand that archaeologists are always willing to re-examine evidence, as you say with Anton Mifsud, and are always willing to change their minds, but it requires sufficient evidence. And the thing is, two teeth are not sufficient evidence necessarily. Now, Anton Mifsud does make a valid point that other human species, such as Denisovans, have been proven with just teeth and jawbones. But it's to counter that, it's also important to note that that was just using DNA to prove that those species exist, those subspecies of humans existed. These two teeth, only two teeth being found, these two teeth being found weren't being used to prove that Neanderthals existed. In fact, they already knew that Neanderthals existed long before then. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made the claim that these are Neanderthal teeth. What they tried to do was they took the two teeth, the three teeth, looked at them, and then without any other evidence, without any lithics, without any butchered animals or animal bones or fire pits, fire cracked rock, any of the other archaeological, any of the other artifacts that would indicate a human presence, cave paintings, what have you, without any of all of that, they still went and made the claim. And that's the issue, is that that three teeth are not sufficient evidence. You would not take, say, if you found only two buttons somewhere in the woods and then decide, you wouldn't do that, grab them and then take those two buttons you found in the woods and go to a court of law and claim, this is where, say, Jimmy Hoffa is buried. The court would throw you out. And in fact, it's also important to note, courts throw out cases all the time due to insufficient evidence. So to assume that archaeology would be any different is a little asinine. But I will acknowledge that this does seem promising. And in fact, I look forward to, if it is real, reading about it, because the project is still going on. But until it is until the rest of the studies in academic journals are released, I'm gonna hold my judgment on whether the Neanderthals were there or not. But it's still important to note that it's still not a lot of evidence. And in fact, the physical anthropologists that he took the teeth to, there are only three physical anthropologists that agree with him currently, which is not a lot of the archaeology and anthropology community. It may change and grow, but right now, it's important to be, I don't want to say skeptical, but be reserved in judgments. Moving on from that, after Graham Hancock's claims in his third episode about Malta, many Maltese archaeologists actually pushed back, including saying, when you consider a long timeline of humanity, millions of years, the Maltese Islands are very young. The very first traces of human habitation date to only 5000 BC. Well, which is, there you go. I mean, we know that. We just looked at it in the paper. I said 6000 BC, but it is 5000 BC, and that is my fault. And things like that. In fact, I did not clip those parts of the article, but I will cite it. Uh, the the archaeologist, one of the archaeologists that he actually does bring on in the documentary, uh, was not happy about it, and she states that much of her words were heavily edited. Now, to be fair, Hancock did not edit those words to say that she agreed with him, but they were still heavily edited, which is poor practice. But also, she does go on to say, for one, well, actually, one of the things she brings up is that culture we'll talk about later in part, later in this video, the Natufians did practice sedentism, did practice sedentism and did live in communities in proto cities, but they also did not make use of pottery. So, to try to make any claims of why Malta started with domesticated animals and started with monumental architecture and then didn't do other things like Graham Hancock tries to claim is a little counterproductive, to say the least. Anyways, she goes on to say that there is actually studies going uh, on the human teeth from Gard Alam, and again, they will be completed and published when they are finished. Sorry, they will be published when they are finished. All right, now we go on to episode 4. So episode 4 starts off focusing on one of the favorite subjects of Atlantis believers ever, one of the most common favorite subjects, the so-called Bimini Road. So the Bimini Road is a rock formation. I want to emphasize that, a rock formation off the coast of the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. And Atlantis, people who believe in Atlantis like to claim that this is some form of road. And they often like to claim that the blocks of the road are uniform and perfectly square or rectangular. Hence why I chose this picture. As you can see, some of them are, in fact, they are not, let me put it this way, they are not uniform. Some of them are sort of ovate or oval-like. Some of them are tall and skinny. Some of them are tall and fat. Some of them are short and fat. Some of them are short and skinny. Not at all uniform. Not only that, so one of the claims that many Atlantis believers like to state, including Hancock in this episode, is that the Bimini Road is unique. No, it's not. First of all, we have, as you can see here in this picture, we have one example like that off the coast of Florida. And then we have, yeah, there we go. Well, there. Yeah, one example like that off the coast of Florida. And then we have another example of very similar rocks, sedimentary rocks breaking off in that shape on a peninsula near Sydney, Australia. So no, they're not unique at all. In fact, there are others, including in Utah and Colorado. These are just the ones that I could find the pictures for. So right off the bat, there's no road to Atlantis or any ancient lost Ice Age civilization off the coast of the Bahamas. It's just a geologic formation in which sedimentary rock happens to break off into these vaguely rectangular square shapes. The next thing he looks at in episode 4 is these formations you see here. He calls these formations, specifically this one that looks like a shark, mounds. Now, it is certainly possible that these are effigy mounds. I was unfortunately unable to find any archaeological academic papers about the study of these formations. But I will say that it is also equally possible that these are just ironically shaped sandbar formations. But playing the devil's advocate, if they were effigy mounds, which one are not uncommon in the Americas or really anywhere else, but if they were effigy mounds, and by the way, here's the Bahamas and Bimini right there. If they were effigy mounds, we wouldn't need to attribute them to Atlantis at all. In fact, we know that there were people there in the Bahamas, the Native Americans, the people such as the Taino and the Macoris, the Niera, the Carina, etc., etc. And we know that these people were seafarers. In fact, in this paper right here, Bazari, the early peopling of the Caribbean, we know that the first people moved into the Caribbean around 8,000 years ago, or around 6,000 BCE, with the earliest some of the earliest sites being dated to around 3,000 BCE, and then going on. In fact, we know, based off of that data, we know that there were multiple migrations, and that some of them replacing the others, and like some people were already there, and some people, like the Taino, came in later around 3,000 years ago and replaced other populations, and then so on and so forth. And then here's some more of that data right here. Feel free to pause and read these graphs. And so, pause to read this. So, as it said, we know quite a lot of it. We know, based off of both the genetic and archaeological record, that the native peoples of the Caribbean were here quite a long time, from at least as far back as 6,000 BCE, around 8,000 years ago, with more peoples moving in later. And then again, here's another graph showing the various different migrations during that period. In fact, the peoples who were here before the Taino were peoples such as the Kalinago nation, or the you would often hear them as the Carib, in which the Caribbean is named after. And then the people who migrated later, around 3,000 years ago, would be the Taino. And here's another paper, pause to read. That you can pause to read. Here are the methods and materials and such, talking about the genetic legacy of the Taino and how they came here around 3,000 years ago. And as I said, what all of this data tells us is that these, all the data via archaeology and genetic data shows that these people were, in fact, very skilled seafarers. So the comment that Hancock makes in this episode, that the shark figure, whether it be an effigy mound or just, again, an ironically shaped sandbar, that this would be a creature that would be recognized by seafaring peoples, yeah, that's right. And who were seafaring peoples back then? The Caribbean tribes, the Taino, the Kalinago, and others. So we don't need to attribute these mounds to Atlantis, because we already know about seafaring peoples who have been here for around 8,000 years. And again, here you go. Here's an image that I've used before, showing the very now I want to say expensive, the very how to put this, the very extensive trade networks that the peoples of the Caribbeans had with peoples in the Atlantic, on the Atlantic coast of South America and the Atlantic coast of Central America. So all of this combined, it's yet again, as I've said with episodes 1 and 2, 1, 2, and 3, there's really no reason for the attribution of Atlantis to the making of these things, because there were people who were already there who already had complex, extensive trade networks and complex cultures. And say in the case of the Caribbean cultures, were seafarers, and therefore would, if these are in fact effigy mounds, have made these effigy mounds. So now we're going on to episode 5. So episode 5, and probably the least surprising of the episodes that he did in the series, is about the very well known at this point ancient temple complex Göbekli Tepe. And of course, as he has actually done multiple times, and other pseudo-archaeologists have done multiple times, has made the claim that this was built by an ancient lost ice age civilization. Yeah. He also makes the claim that essentially, very similar to his Gigantea claim, that there are no transitional temples or earlier, simpler temples before Göbekli Tepe was built. And so therefore, rather than the Neolithic hunter-gatherers who most archaeologists, actually all archaeologists, attribute to build, who most all archaeologists are pretty sure who built this temple. Hancock, of course, says no, it couldn't have been them. It had to have been an outside force, i.e., this Atlantis, this Ice Age civilization coming in and doing it for them. But again, he's wrong. For one thing, we do have earlier, simpler things. In fact, we have the ancient proto-city of Tel al-Sultan that you see here, which is actually in modern-day Jericho. And as you can see in this academic paper by Lorenzo Nigro, in the journal The Archaeology of Collapse and Resilience, he actually talks about the building of Jericho, and he says that it was inhabited by the Mesolithic Natufian period groups who were hunters and gatherers, who then started to build this proto-city during the Proto-Neolithic period around 9000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe was built around 8500 BCE, so around 10,500 years ago. Yeah, 8,500 years ago. So we do have an earlier site built that was a proto-city. And again, you can pause to read. Okay. Yeah. So there we go. And they did have some domesticated plants and things like that. So here we go to examine an area that he likes to talk about a lot, the Younger Dryas. So his claim is that essentially the Younger Dryas event, an event where the climate drastically changed over a very short period of time, only a few centuries, led to the collapse of this ancient Ice Age civilization. And the ancient Ice Age civilization came into the Levant, the Middle East, and taught these people how to build cities and temples and things. However, in this paper right here, titled High Resolution AMS Dates from Shubakwa 1, Northeast Jordan, reveal complex origins of the late Paleolithic Natufian in the Levant. Again, pause to read. But essentially, what this paper says is that many of the Natufian people actually began to immigrate into this area and start to create much larger, and much more permanent settlements, or between actually 14,600 and 13,600 years ago. So around 12,600 and 11,600 BCE. And they do say that the Younger Dryas did have an effect on them. And again, you can pause to read this. Again, apologies for the slight blurriness. However, however, they say that so essentially, I'll go ahead and read this. The dates for phase 1 at Shabakwa 1 indicate substantial presence of late Natufian groups in eastern Jordan during the mid to late Younger Dryas, although there's a large gap in sequence between phase 2 and phase 1, covering the earlier part of the Younger Dryas. Our evidence suggests that the area was not completely abandoned for all of the Younger Dryas, as Hancock likes to claim. More importantly, although there is a gap, it can be argued that there is nevertheless a certain degree in continuity as people return to the same settlement location even after a long interruption. In light of the new evidence, the concept of the Natufian core requires critical evaluation. Evidence presented here and from other regions in the Levant indicate that substantial early Natufian base camp type sites existed outside the Mediterranean zone as early as 14,600 years ago to 14,400 years ago, and that the Natufians did not arrive in eastern Jordan as part of the dispersal from the west during the Younger Dryas. This apparently more heterogeneous process suggests that there was not one pathway from complex hunting and gathering to food production during the transition from the Epipaleolithic to the early Neolithic in the Levant, which it puts a pretty big nail in Hancock's hypothesis. And it goes on to say, if people pursued multiple plant subsistence strategies in various ecotones and regions, more or less at the same time, it suggests that there were also multiple routes towards the emergence of the Neolithic economy. This underscores, in our view, that the emergence of plant cultivation and animal domestication and the Neolithic way of life was highly variable and much more complex, a more complex process that cannot be explained on the basis of a single cause model. I.e., while the Younger Dryas did have an effect on the Natufian peoples who built Tel al Sultan and eventually Göbekli Tepe and other temple sites, it was not the only thing, and these people were actually here far longer than the end of the Younger Dryas period, and they were already creating more sedentary sites and were already moving to more complex subsistence strategies rather than just hunter-gatherer. And here's another one showing the exact same thing. Feel free to pause and read. And showing all the same thing, pause and read. But essentially, so this paper is titled Climate Change, Adaptive Cycles, and the Persistence of Foraging Economies During the Late Pleistocene and Holocene Transition in the Levant. And as I said, pause and read these pages. But the conclusion is that, let's see here. In the past, economic adjustment to climate change was not a product of climate forcing in a simple cause and effect relationship leading to a hypothetical collapse, but rather it was a complex interplay between the environment and social behavior in response to change within the context of past experience and increasing potential for landscape domestication. Therefore, understanding the climate variability on society requires a more holistic consideration of the environment, the effect of human behavior on landscapes, and the possibility of social memory and traditional knowledge, enhancing the social capacity to adjust and respond to change. And then earlier on, it also talks about it says, we argue that the Younger Dryas did not initiate the eventual collapse of foraging systems that led to the earliest cereal cultivation in the southern Levant. Rather, the late Natufians relied on long-term social memory of past experience, and they initiated a series of subsistence procurement responses that were similar to those responses of early epipaleolithic peoples who faced the cold and dry climate of the late glacial maximum, and then on and on and on. So again, the Younger Dryas, while it did have an effect, it was not because of the development. It did not destroy the societies that lived here already as far back as 14,600 years ago, and it was not because of their developing more complex societies. It was just it did not. It did the opposite. Let me rephrase that. It did not lead to the collapse of these foraging societies that already existed here. It actually was the catalyst for them to become much more sedentary. Which means, despite what, which essentially again puts a nail in the coffin to Hancock's hypothesis that essentially, despite what he claims that the Younger Dryas period was the end of civilization, it in fact may have actually been the catalyst to create these new civilizations. And I should also say civilization is a little bit of a loaded term because some people quantify it differently, and so some archaeologists, actually quite a few archaeologists, are trying to move away from that concept. But for the sake of this video, we're going to go ahead and go with that. And so, in fact, these two papers that I just showed you suggest that the Younger Dryas was actually the catalyst that led to these hunter-gatherer societies, the Natufians, who were already in the Levant 14,000 years ago. It led them to become much more sedentary and to develop cities rather than the opposite way around. Furthermore, another nail in the coffin to Hancock's claims, specifically the claim that there are no simpler sites. Tel al Sultan actually does have a earlier tower that is, as you can see, is far simpler and looks like it would have been far easier to construct than Göbekli Tepe would have been. And in fact, as you can pause and read, one, it was built, the so-called Tower of Jericho was built around the same time as Göbekli Tepe, 8300 BCE, give or take. But it was also aligned to various celestial events, such as the sun and etc. You can pause to read all of that. So again, this puts a nail in the coffin of Hancock's hypothesis, because it shows that essentially, one, societies began to develop during and before the Younger Dryas, not after, and they didn't collapse after. Before, during, and after the Younger Dryas, and they didn't collapse after. And there were actually simpler sites, transitional sites, before Göbekli Tepe. Okay, so the next thing with Göbekli Tepe that Hancock takes a look at is this pillar, this carving that you see right here. And to examine it, he contacts an individual by the name of Dr. Martin Sweatman. Now, I should say before I go into this, Dr. Martin Sweatman is an academic. However, he is not an archaeologist. He's not an anthropologist. He's not an astronomer or an astrophysicist or anything like that. And I'll explain that in a second. He is a mechanical and a statistical engineer. So, anyways, but what Martin Sweatman proposes is that essentially this pillar right here, this carving, is depicting the zodiac. That's right, the zodiac, like Sagittarius and Aries and things like that. And his main piece of evidence is this scorpion right here, which he claims is Scorpio, which, fine. It's not impossible that the scorpion represents Scorpio. I mean, after all, the descendants of the people who settled here and settled in the region and built Göbekli Tepe, the Mesopotamians, did have Scorpio as part of their uh, constellation system, as part of their zodiac. But none of these other objects match up. He also likes to claim that this head here, this little circle here, is the sun. He also openly claims, especially in this video here, that you can go, that I will have in this in the iCard. You can go to this timestamp right here. Actually, just a couple of seconds before, 9 minutes and 50 seconds, but still. And Martin Sweatman actually admits that he came up with this hypothesis after reading Graham Hancock's book, Magicians of the Gods. Which, again, I want to acknowledge that Martin Sweatman is an academic. He does have a doctorate in his field, and he does work at a university as a professor. But it's also important to note, forming a hypothesis based off of pseudo-archaeology is highly problematic. Anyways, other archaeologists have actually critiqued this Sweatman's hypothesis that the carvings on Göbekli Tepe, column A, I believe is what it is. The carvings on column A are the zodiac. Multiple archaeologists critiqued this in a paper titled "More Than a Vulture: A Response to Sweatman and Sitchrisis and his partner," authored by Jens Notroff et al. And you can pause to read the abstract and pause to read the paper. But essentially, they make a couple of key arguments. One, the carvings, just because there's a scorpion on the carving, which is a critique I've often used, doesn't mean it's a constellation. In fact, there's no way of us knowing that the people who built Göbekli Tepe even had the same constellation system as we did. For example, Sweatman likes to argue that this vulture here, the wingspan is the Boa Sagittarius. Again, there's no way of knowing that they would have had the same constellation system. Furthermore, the constellation system we had took a while to develop because it was actually a combination of the Greek constellation system the Greek constellation system and the Mesopotamian constellation system, with the Greek constellation system actually being a combination of let me phrase that. The Greek constellation system is the constellation system we have now, and it was a combination of three constellation systems: the Minoan and the Mycenaean constellation system. The Minoan's a little bit iffy, but the Mycenaean for sure, and the Mesopotamian constellation systems. So three different constellation systems over several thousand years had to be combined to create the constellation system we have now. So already that's making a massive assumption that these pillars show the modern constellation system that has existed since the Hellenic period in the Roman Empire. Also, as this paper discusses, these pillars oftentimes have entire pillars designated to one specific animal. Like some are focused on, say, foxes, others are on the birds, others are on uh, see here, let's see, snakes and boars and all kinds of things like that. All so that and it all that all that being said, it's it's just doesn't look very good that this is the zodiac. And you can pause again to read. For but it's to finish off all of this. But essentially, looking at those considerations, for one thing, the human, and I'll talk about this more in just a couple of minutes. The circle that the bird is holding, that the vulture is holding, is more likely a human head. In fact, we know modified human heads and butchered human heads and other things related to a skull cult that I'll talk about in a minute are known from Göbekli Tepe. So, yeah, that's to say that that's the sun is a little bit is reaching a little bit. Therefore, the study goes on that essentially they require much more evidence before they can assume that it is based off of any constellation system. Okay, now on to what I was just talking about. So the big nail in the coffin to this idea that the figures on this pillar are representative of the zodiac is this figure right here. See, this figure right here at the bottom corner is actually a beheaded human figure. And so the circular carving that the vulture is holding, the eagle, vulture, what have you, is holding, is actually a human head. And this actually backed up in other carvings like this one that you can see here, where you see a bird with a human head, and you can see the sort of the eyes and the nose right there above its wings. So we actually have much more precedent to this over here being a human head. And that's because we have evidence of what, as I said a few minutes ago, essentially a skull cult. As discussed in this paper titled Modified Human Crania from Göbekli Tepe, provide evidence for a new form of Neolithic skull cult, authored by Julia Gresky, Juliane Haelm, and Lee Clare. And again, pause to read. And here's some of the skulls that were. I'll go back and actually, take a couple more seconds to pause to read. Anyways, but you can see here how the heads were modified. Fragment of frontal bone with carvings, fragment of parietal bone with drilled perforation, fragment of parietal bone with carvings, etc., etc. And you can see here's another graph talking about all the kind of things that were used, like the Upper Paleolithic skull cup production in combination with cannibalism. Another cranium, skull cup production, marking and counting a series of vents on a long bone, profane tool paddle for smoothing surfaces in a clay vessel or production, long bone, skull cap production, on and on and on, amulets with magical or ritual function. Basically, anything that these bones and skulls could be used for, they were. And so what it says right here, it's like you can read to pause. Essentially, you can pause to read. Essentially, the three modified skulls from Göbekli Tepe represent an entirely new category of find, which testifies to the interaction of the living with the dead at this important early Neolithic ritual center. These skulls, most likely removed from the post-cranium in the frame of the secondary burial rites, attest to the special post-mortem treatment of certain individuals at Göbekli Tepe. And it goes on to read about that, read more about that. pause to read. It's like, and it finishes with, in addition, Göbekli Tepe is unique because of its rich, distinct repertoire of artistic representations, primarily images of animals. The T-shaped pillars themselves are anthropomorphic, as testified in some cases by carvings of low reliefs showing arms, hands, and clothing. The artistic repertoire also includes numerous stone statues and figurines of animals and humans, as well as small finds adorned with manifold depictions of symbols. The material provides insights into a deep-rooted hunter-gatherer worldview, which involved a skull cult, probably including narratives and myths dating back to the Epipaleolithic, and at Göbekli Tepe for the first time immortalized in stone. As such, they may be considered expressions of common origin and identity that would have been so important for communities facing the challenges connected with the Neolithicization process. It is this realization that makes Göbekli Tepe such a key site for our comprehension of the pivotal period in human history. So, yeah. So, essentially, no, the carvings on Pillar A are not the zodiac. They are some form of mythology being acted out, and mythology involving a skull cult and the importance of skulls in being used as a sort of an additional burial method. And of course, as with everything else at Göbekli Tepe, we actually see sort of a precedent for this at the earlier proto-cities like Tel Al Sultan. As mentioned in this paper, the plastered skulls from the pre-pottery Neolithic B site of Yiftahal, Israel, a computed tomography-based analysis, authored by Vivian Sloan et al. So you can see here are some of the specimens. Pause to read. And their conclusions are anatomical study and technical study of the three plastered skulls from Yiftahal allows us to position them within the record of artificially remodeled skulls from the Levant. The similarities and differences in style and technique of remodeling may be used to shed light on the pre-pottery Neolithic P populations. In terms of social and economic and cultural exchanges, the shift from hunter-gatherer groups to agricultural settlements during this period entailed many lifestyle changes, including the increasing need to mark territories, probably accompanied by variations in spiritual and religious beliefs as reflected in mortuary practices. In the case of Yiftahal, the differences in modeling between the skulls and their arrangements may suggest a social hierarchy within the Yiftahal community, probably based on age and sex. Future studies on their relation with other burials on the site using ancient DNA methods may shed further light on the plastered skull phenomenon, which remains a fascinating subject for debate. So, there you have it. As with at Göbekli Tepe, this is connected to some complex social rites dating back to earlier than the pre-pottery Neolithic. And in case of Yiftahal, it may have some context with hierarchy, but as the case with Göbekli Tepe, it has something to do with the mortuary, ceremonial, and religious practices. And I would argue, and I'm sure many archaeologists are already arguing this, I am not an expert in this field, that these are probably connected, and therefore one may not be, in fact, one is most certainly probably not mutually exclusive from the other. So we already have, as I said, the precedent for those carvings to represent this skull cult, because we have multiple iterations of the skull cult in the region by the same cultural peoples. Okay, so that is the end of part 1. Part 2, we will go through episodes 6 through 8. I hope I look forward. Well, sorry, no, I don't look forward to doing that, but it has to be done. If you have any questions for me about anything I talked about in this video, feel free to leave a comment, and remember to like, share, and subscribe.